now listening to the Real Monsters podcast with Nate and Ray.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Real Monsters podcast, the only podcast where we look thoroughly into the career of Adam Sandler. I'm Nate.
I am Ray.
Would you call yourself a Sandler head?
Let me see. That's a tall order. I guess it depends on which side of Sandler I woke up on.
We're actually not an Adam Sandler only podcast, but we do talk about movies.
Wait, we're not?
Well, wait, I forgot. We're not. I forgot to tell you this, Ray. I'm sorry. We're changing the direction. We're not just going to talk about Grown Ups 2 anymore.
Can we at least include references?
Yes, absolutely. I'm cool.
Okay, cool.
Now, this isn't a visual podcast, but if you could see what's going on right now, Ray is reenacting the scene from Grown Ups 2 where Kevin James gets up on a counter in front of an ice cream machine and pulls the lever to make it look like he's pooping. Just visualize that right now.
You want to know what's funny? I actually have never seen Grown Ups 2.
Oh, I apologize. That's something that's missing from your life. You need to get on that right away. It's a critically acclaimed masterpiece.
Well, we're talking about critically acclaimed masterpieces. I have a question.
I have an answer.
Are you familiar with this guy named Ari Aster?
That sounds familiar. He's the guy that did the movie about Toni Collette's struggle with motherhood, right?
Yeah, let's go with that. Yeah, that's totally what I got out of it.
Did you see that Ari Aster short film that he did, The Strange Thing About the Johnsons?
No, I didn't. I know what it's about. I'm not sure if I am open-minded enough to go there.
Let's just say it's all in the family.
Oh, I know what it's about for sure. I'm not sure if I'm involved enough to get down with that.
Ari Aster actually said it's an unofficial prequel to the Fast and the Furious franchise.
Well, that makes sense because
it's
family.
all about family. Yeah. No, it's messed up, but it really kind of gives you a little bit of a dive into what Aster's career would become. And I appreciate the world of the fucked up and the disturbed.
I was reading an article earlier this week where Ari Aster is working on a movie called Disappointment Boulevard starring Joaquin Phoenix. And I guess the movie didn't make it to the Cannes Film Festival because of its runtime being 3 hours and a half. And A24 wants a shorter version, and he just kind of refuses to cut it down from 3.5 hours.
That's my man. Don't give it up. I want 3.5 hours of Ari Aster content because he is someone who has a vision and he executes his vision really well. And if he says that he has 3.5 hours of quality content to give us, then 3.5 hours is what I want.
So that it struck me as a really interesting topic of conversation because I feel like in the movie world, we used to have these epics like Ben-Hur or even most recently the Lord of the Rings movies where people will go watch, my older brother, he's a huge Lord of the Rings fan, and he will watch and binge actually all 3 extended cuts. And those aren't short movies. And we used to have a time where we had a director's cut of Kingdom of Heaven that was almost clocking at 4 hours. And all of a sudden, people are daunted by a movie that's, over 2.5 hours. So I wanted to talk a little bit about movie lengths and how do we feel about it and why do we feel like that has shifted?
It's funny that you say that. So I've watched 2 movies this year that were clocked around the 3-hour runtime. One was a film that you saw, Ray, which was The Batman, the Matt Reeves film. And then a movie that was nominated for an Academy Award last year called Drive My Car. And what's so funny to me is both of those movies, which obviously they're very different subject matter wise, and they're both trying to convey something incredibly different, they felt like a breeze to me. I mean, they both felt like 20-minute movies. I didn't feel like they were 3 hours long, and I think we've talked about this a little bit before together, but I think in an age where you have TikTok and Instagram Reels and Facebook Reels, that the younger generation wanting everything at their fingertips immediately, and that sense of instant gratification is so important to people that they don't take a second to just kind of sit back and say, hey, there's this creative vision and this thing that a director wants to give to you, and you should be able to sit and enjoy it. And I understand we've seen long films before that we could say are bloated and that there's scenes that are too long, but I think cinema is an experience, and if someone wants to offer me that level of experience, I'm fine with it.
I remember, so we were talking about this earlier. One of my all-time favorite movies from the last decade is Blade Runner 2049, and the reason why I was bringing it up earlier is because that movie was a flop. And it was interesting to see it being a flop because it had everything going for it. It was a legacy sequel that was actually critically well received. It was by Denis Villeneuve, who had just come off the high of being nominated for an Oscar for Arrival. It had Ryan Gosling, who doesn't love Ryan Gosling. It just had everything going for it. And Villeneuve basically said that that movie is the most expensive art house film ever made. It didn't really do that well in theaters. I remember I saw it twice in theaters, and both times the theater was empty, basically. I kind of got interested in that topic as to why that movie was such a flop, and a lot of people kept saying, oh, it's the runtime. It's too long. It's too long. And then I was like, it's 2 hours and 45 minutes. So how is that too long? And then it got me thinking of other long movies, but then I remember The Lord of the Rings being over, The Return of the King being over 3 hours long, and they still show that. They'll still have anniversary viewings that will get theaters packed for a movie that's nearly 4 hours. Just recently we had the Justice League director's cut by Zack Snyder that was 4 hours, and people were all excited about that.
It's funny you mentioned Return of the King, because I actually saw Return of the King in the theater on opening night, and that was like packed. It was like people crammed side by side in the theater, and I ended up seeing it again like a week later, and it was still just as crowded in the theater. A lot of times too, I think it has to do with, and I'm sure this is a topic we'll talk about too, about streaming versus seeing things in a theater. And part of me wonders if, when you watch something at home, you have that ability to press pause and you can get up, and it's like people feel like, oh my God, it's a 2.5 hour runtime. I'm going to have to get up and pee, or I'm going to have to refill my popcorn or something. Home now, because of that accessibility, you can just hit pause on your TV, go get what you need, and come back and sit down. So I think there's so many different factors in it. I really hope that filmmakers aren't discouraged. Batman this year, Matt Reeves, I felt like for a film that was almost a 3 hour runtime, that every second of screen time was so well utilized, and I didn't feel like it was bloated. It felt like reading a really incredible Batman comic book series.
I love that movie. And yeah, I remember watching it, and after the movie was over, it didn't feel like it had been 3 hours. And if you think about it, it was probably closer to 3.5 hours if you count all the trailers at first. I thought it was interesting reading that about Ari Aster, because he is sticking to his guns about the runtime of his movie, but it makes me worry if there's going to be something that affects him, because... And not affects him in like he's going to start doing conventional movies. I don't think that's going to be the case. But we always talk about wanting original stories. But do we really want original stories, or we just want something convenient and neatly packed into 90 minutes?
A24 put that Blu-ray out, the director's cut, that was like, what was the length of the director's cut? Almost 3 hours, right?
I think it's about 3 hours.
Interesting, because it feels like A24 understands their audience and they know who's coming to see their films. And with something like Everything Everywhere All at Once recently, that was only like a little over 2 hours, but like the fan base behind A24 as a production company, they know who's going to come see their films, and especially with a director attached with an idea like Ari Aster, you'd think, shit, the thing could be 6 hours and people would show up.
Yeah, you would hope at least, but I don't know. I just thought it was interesting. The thing that struck me as most interesting is A24 wanting Ari Aster to cut it down. However, yeah, we love A24 and there is a following, but I feel like most A24 movies don't really make their budget back. So I wonder if that's starting to become a worry for A24 to be like, we need to make money.
Well, yeah, and that's like, I noticed since COVID happened, there's a lot of A24 films that I notice are they'll release them in the theaters, and then 2 weeks later they'll do that. What are they? The A24 screening room, I think is what they call it.
Yeah, I feel like they started that with the Green Knight, or that popularized it a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean it makes sense because it's like, and like I said, we'll talk about this in the future about streaming versus seeing things in a theater, but I wonder if it's just like, how can we make our money back on these films, because they want to continue to give people the platform to make the content that they want. I love seeing these production companies get big. Like I'm really excited about how big Neon is getting, and Neon has been putting out some movies that are on the quality or better than A24 films.
Yeah, we can thank Bong Joon-ho for that one too.
Oh yeah, between Parasite and Possessor and Spencer and shit, Portrait of a Lady on Fire was Neon. There's been so many great Neon movies over the past several years.
Yeah, I remember when I saw the neon. Now I get excited when I see the neon logo attached to a movie now. Just kind of like I do with A24. Now when I see that neon logo, I get excited. I'm like, oh, okay, I'm about to watch something different.
I mean, shit, they just picked up the Cronenberg film, The Crimes of the Future. They're distributing that, so they're going to be picking up some great content. And so it's cool, as people like us who are big film lovers, it's really awesome that these production companies are getting great movies to distribute, and that people, because at the end of the day they're a production company, and we lived in a childhood time where we saw Paramount and Universal and all these companies that were huge, and it's nice to see these smaller, more independent production companies get larger to where people are like, oh my god, I can't wait to see this film.
Yeah, it is daunting to look at a long runtime, but at the same time is, last night, for example, I couldn't sleep, so I watched 2 episodes of Ted Lasso and like 3 episodes of Community, and that probably all clocked in at like 2.5 hours.
Exactly. Like tonight, the new Stranger Things season airs, and how many people do you think are going to watch every episode of that and stay up all night long to watch the entire series? We should be less concerned as audience members with runtime and more concerned about content, and as long as the content matches the runtime, who cares? I had a lot of fun talking about those directors with you last week, Ray. Did you enjoy it as much as I did? Because I thought it was so cool that you gave me some new content to watch and some new filmmakers to appreciate.
I did love it. I just feel a little ashamed because my schedule is so tight that out of all the movies we talked about, I was only able to watch one of them, versus you went ahead and just binged 2 full filmographies.
I watched every film that you recommended, and and it was really cool to me when you texted me about one of the films we're going to be discussing today. It just made me so happy to know that I was able to share something with you that resonated with you and that you loved so much, and that now that's something that you're going to share with other people, and vice versa for what you shared with me. I'm going to share these movies with other people, and we don't have a huge platform yet. Even with my YouTube channel, I don't have a huge platform, but being able to have that kind of area where I can say hey, my friend Ray introduced me to these guys, Moorhead and Benson, and I absolutely love their films, and you should really take the time to go watch them. Or RKSS makes incredible movies, go see them. And I think that's so cool that in doing this podcast that you and I are going to be able to do that more than just in the last episode we made, but in the future we're going to have a lot of recommendations for each other, and I'm really excited about that.
And this is the part of the show when we are going to officially, I'm going to say it. Are you ready? Are you ready, Nate? I'm going to say it.
I'm ready.
A spoiler warning is in effect for Turbo Kid.
We're talking about 2 movies today. We're talking about Turbo Kid and Thunder Road, which Ray and I both watched. I rewatched Thunder Road and watched Turbo Kid for the first time, and Ray did the same. He rewatched Turbo Kid and watched Thunder Road for the first time. And we're going to talk about these movies in depth, and we've given some announcements on Instagram to let you guys know what movies to check out. So hopefully you've watched them. If not, go find these movies and watch them, and then come back and listen to Ray and I talk about them.
Since we were already on the road, on the BMX road to the wasteland, this is the future. The future is 1997.
1998. 1997, 1998.
It's the late 90s.
A time I was 7 or 8 years old at that period in time.
Yeah, same.
Ray, I'm so glad you introduced me to this movie because I absolutely loved it. I'm very much into films that utilize specific time periods that aren't necessarily just like nostalgia bait, but using that time period to just kind of create this world and immerse you into this environment. And one of the things I really appreciate with this movie in particular, with RKSS, this is their first film. Obviously, they're, kind of getting their bearings. This film doesn't have a very large budget. But what I loved about it is that the budget was utilized so well into the periods of the film that it mattered.
I was so I was actually rewatching it right before we got on this call, and for those who haven't seen it, which you go watch them. I mean, just go watch them. There's at the very beginning you see the kid, because he doesn't have a name. He's just the kid. He is riding in his BMX bike, and he has those little like glasses where you insert the little disc and you can look at moving pictures. I remember having those as a kid, in the 90s, and I remember loving just sitting through and watching all these like images, click with these images. And when you find out why he has it and why it means so much, it's almost like, yeah, that's why it meant so much to me as well.
Yes, it's awesome. And it's, like I said, it's using those nostalgic elements, but less of just being like nostalgia baity, where it's like, oh, remember that? This movie, I felt like utilized the nostalgia of the time period to just kind of build that world, and I loved it. And yes, I like that this movie just kind of drops you into this world where you get that little brief exposition of what's going on, and then it's just like, boom, here we go. This is what you're in for. And one of the things I love about this movie, Ray, is it does not pull any punches as far as the violence is concerned.
No, it is a very violent movie, and it's not concerned with how it carries itself either. It's definitely all killer, pun intended, no filler.
Yes, and that's what I like, that the violence is almost like Bugs Bunny or Looney Tune-esque, if that's the right way to explain it. It's like, yes, it's over the top and it's gratuitous, and you see like limbs flying, heads rolling off, guts pouring out, but it's less grotesque and more played for a comedic punchline, which I really appreciated.
And I feel like a lot of people talk about the gore and the over-the-topness of this movie, but the relationship between the kid and the girl he meets, Apple, at first, it's almost kind of jarring when she shows up on the screen. And she just wants to be his friend. And in a world where you probably shouldn't trust anyone around you, kind of showing that relationship and that openness to being vulnerable to someone when you're supposed to be on survival mode is actually really endearing. Because I feel like we live in a world where we have to be guarded.
There's one thing that is important in this world to know, and that everyone agrees on, and that's Zeus is bad.
Yeah, we all collectively agree Zeus is bad.
When Apple was first introduced, I was kind of like, wow, she's really just kind of like pouring herself out there, and she's really kind of like, and you can see it in the kid's face. He's kind of off put by her at first, but I love how the film introduces her, and you get that explanation as to why she acts the way that she acts, and it made the movie so much more fun and engaging. It almost felt like you were reading a comic book, which makes so much sense with the Turbo Rider comics that are introduced, and I liked that so much.
Which, this is something I thought was really cool because it's not really explained. It doesn't really, like, it just gives you the, which I love that it doesn't really gives you some exposition. It just drops you in it. Apparently Turbo Rider was real. He really did exist in that world.
I loved when he finds Turbo Rider and he gets the outfit off of him, but when he pulls the helmet off, he's like, nah, I'm not using that. That's disgusting. I'm just going to use my own. There's so many great moments. I talked about this in the first episode about why I love Edgar Wright so much, but I felt like this movie and RKSS did such a good job of comedic punchlines that are less about dialogue delivery and more about placement of the camera. Like, oh my God, Ray, that battle sequence where the torsos are just like flying everywhere and they're like stacked on top of each other, like the way that they would fall into place and the way the camera would linger on them, I had to pause the movie because of how hard I was laughing.
There's something almost anime-esque about that scene where they're trying to have this really dramatic like face-off with Zeus, but then off in the background you see this stack of corpses just kind of aimlessly wandering around.
It's so well done, and that's That's what I love so much about this movie is you could tell that RKSS had a vision and they wanted to execute this vision in a very specific way. And what we were just talking about before about giving the little guys a chance, the people who gave these guys the chance to make this movie should be commended, because what we got is like an hour and a half long just thrill ride that I would be lying if I told you that I didn't have a smile on my face the entire time I watched it. I was grinning from ear to ear this whole movie because it felt like something that I would have watched in the theaters or like on VHS in the 90s. And it was nice to feel that way about a movie again.
There's something to be said too about almost the innocence of the main characters. You know, you have that great sequence where he bumps into the cowboy guy and he's like, "What are you doing? Don't you know that's a man's bubble, a personal space reserved for family only?"
I loved that. Also, a world where you arm wrestle and if you lose you're like branded.
There's such like innocence about it. And when he runs into Apple, because you can tell that this kid probably hasn't had an interaction with a girl before, he's almost conflicted by how he's supposed to behave. Am I supposed to be tough? Am I supposed to be sweet? Am I supposed to be understanding? Am I supposed to push this girl away? And even's like, "You're touching my manly bubble thing." Like, even he's so confused by how he's supposed to behave around her. But something that I thought was really endearing is that the one person that has emotions, feelings, and happiness is Apple, who you find out is a robot.
Yes.
I thought that was a really interesting way that in this messed up world, the one being that has a sense of light and positivity is a robot.
And I want to go back just a little bit to what you were saying about that, like, innocence in this movie. I love the innocence paralleled with just the sheer brutality, because this world is very brutal. The scene where Michael Ironside kidnaps them and they're in that like pool and he's telling them about the machine that converts blood into water. And I love that, like, Apple's enthusiasm about fighting these people and like fighting for survival is so childlike compared to the very disturbing way that these people are being brutally ripped apart. Combining those two elements just creates such a unique experience, because you're laughing and you're like, should I really be laughing at this? No, but I'm going to continue to do it because it's a hell of a lot of fun.
It really is. And I also love, because it's almost like a coming of age thing as well, where the kid, he's perfectly fine living in seclusion away from everybody and just surviving on his own. He kind of, it's one of those, like, he has to jump into the role he was given. You know, he joins up with unlikely characters. And by the end of the movie, he's pretty much his own man, which is something he's navigating at the very beginning of the movie, but doesn't really quite know how to do it. And I just thought it was interesting that in order for him to become his own man and come to terms to who he is, he had to have some connections with other people before he could reach the point where he was comfortable with himself.
The growth of his character, and obviously like how his past plays into that, and knowing obviously through the flashback sequences what happened to his parents, but how he's forced to grow in this specific circumstance. And I thought that was brilliant. And I also don't want to get through this conversation without mentioning one of my favorite characters in the movie, the merchant guy, who literally, I don't know if you agree with me, Ray, got one of the worst deaths of anyone.
Yeah, and that's saying a lot in a movie where limbs are flying everywhere.
When he like is begging Michael Ironside not to die, and Michael Ironside looks at him, he's like, "Do you know how long it took me to put this together and rig this up?" Literally had a rope tied around his intestines on a bicycle. That character too, the I don't know if he has like a name. I can't remember if the guy with the skull mask on. Oh my God, his little like gun with the saw blades in it. That was so awesome. I loved that get up and his whole thing. He was so menacing.
That was something I was going to bring up. The custom design, like just what they're, because you can tell that they're all very improvised body armors and costumes that they just probably picked off as they were scavenging, which makes sense. It wouldn't make sense that they would have all this crazy technology. You can tell that they're just survivors rigging up whatever they can find along the road to be more menacing. And I love that character so much. He does this little like twitch every time he's confronting someone, but he never actually talks, but he says so much more with just little gimmicks like his twitch, and his eyes are just bulging wide so you can see them through the mask.
And I love that we don't get really any insight into his character or where he came from. It's just like he's evil, and he's going to be evil the whole movie.
I'm sure he was kind of like part of... You remember that guy that plays the guitar on Mad Max Fury Road?
Yes!
It was almost like that. Like, it's almost a caricature character of its own, that he's just there and we just accept that that's the character, and we just love that character. We don't need more. We just love it.
And also, Ray, before we end our Turbo Kid discussion, which I love talking about this movie with you, we would both be remiss if we didn't discuss the score to this film, which honestly might go down as one of my favorite scores I've heard recently. I think that synth-driven music just takes you to another time, and it really kind of just builds the emotion in these scenes to make you care for these characters more, and it kind of just makes it like relentless. I mean, your heart's just pounding at every scene because of how driven this score is.
So something really cool about that score, Death Waltz and Mondo have pressed that score multiple times. It's been pressed so many times that it wouldn't surprise me if there's another repress down the future, and I'll keep you posted if that happens. But I remember I used to have a first pressing of it just in your standard black first pressing, and then Mondo has done various color pressings, and you know, they were cool, but I'm happy with my black pressing. And then just recently, last year, they did a repressing where it's a Toxic Wasteland glow-in-the-dark green. I'm not a big glow-in-the-dark vinyl person, but that one just matches not only the music, but the mood of that movie so well to have this like toxic green glow-in-the-dark vinyl. The score is incredible. I also love the opening track, like that very 80s heavy metal song.
It really kind of sets the tone for what you're getting in for. I absolutely love the score to this film. It really is, it's very Carpenter-esque, and I love films that have that like Carpenter feel to them. He's just such a genius when it comes to setting mood and tone for film, and I think it just adds on in Turbo Kid to just make this movie what it is, which is an experience.
The composer, it's a French-Canadian group called Les Matos, and they have done other scores. In fact, they've done the score for everything RKSS has done, because before Turbo Kid, they had like a mini short film that was like 15 minutes long that's like super low budget. They also scored a mini series called Exode that was like a little mini series on YouTube. They just make great music. So if you just like any like dancey synthwave type music, check out Les Matos, because they've done all sorts of cool stuff, including scoring all of the properties that RKSS has worked on. Honestly, and just to wrap it up, Turbo Kid is a fun movie. It's heartfelt. It makes you smile. It makes you laugh. And the only thing I can see people being a little turned off by, if they're not fans of like over-the-top gore, is that if you're not a person that enjoys gore, I really would highly recommend just trying to stomach through some of it, because ultimately the movie is a fun movie. Like, it really is fun. It is the definition of a fun movie for me.
Oh, 100%. I completely agree. I felt like the whole time I'm watching, I'm like, man, I feel like a kid again, like watching this really absurdly violent but entertaining movie that like I would have been so excited if I was like 13 or 14 and been like, oh my god, my parents rented me this movie because the cover looked cool, but they don't know how violent this is. And yeah, it just kind of takes you to another time, and I loved it so much, and I cannot thank you enough for recommending it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually really happy you enjoyed it as much as you did.
Yes, so this is Ray and I saying go watch Turbo Kid if you listen to it all the way, us talk about it all the way through. If for some reason you hadn't watched it yet, you just got it spoiled for you, but you'll still enjoy it just as much. So go watch Turbo Kid. And that takes us to our next part of the conversation, which is I recommended the film Thunder Road for Ray to watch from director Jim Cummings. And Ray, I talked to you a little bit about this beforehand, but I'm just really excited to hear your thoughts about it and how you felt about this movie, because it's a movie that really means a lot to me, and I was really excited for you to get to see it.
I remember you kind of explaining the premise of it. I put it on, and it was really interesting because even the way the movie starts, you're just dropped in this funeral. You're just dropped in this funeral, and Jim Cummings, who plays the lead character, gets up and he's gonna give the eulogy for the death of his mom. And you would think, oh, it's gonna be very reverent, because we're all so used to socially to expect certain events to play out a certain way. And when he gets up, and at first I was cracking up, laughing, because I'm like, this guy's hilarious. And then he starts breaking down, and he has these moments where he breaks down and then kind of tries to alleviate the tension with a joke, but then the joke just kind of makes people more uncomfortable. And which, by the way, I was going to ask, was that a continuous shot from the moment he gets up to the moment he leaves?
I believe so. With what I talked about in the last episode, when they shot the original short film, it was one continuous take for 15 minutes. I can't remember if they cut it all in the movie. I don't think that they do, but the difference between the short film and the feature-length film is in the short film they actually did use the track Thunder Road from Bruce Springsteen, but when they put this movie out in theaters they couldn't get the rights to it, so that's why they had to do the whole thing with the boombox screwing up and him not being able to use the song.
That's interesting, because I even remember at one point I'm like, well, can you just play it from your phone? It looks like this movie takes place in modern times. And he even mentioned it himself. He's like, I guess I could have played it on my phone.
That intro sequence is so beautiful to me, because I feel like, and obviously this is a theme we'll talk about through the entire movie, but this is about how you process grief and how you deal with grief. And I love that it's so sloppy, and that it's so, like you said, there's times where you're laughing really hard, but then there's also these beautiful moments, like he's talking about how he has a learning disability, and when he went to college that his mom would stay up really late making him flashcards, and like he breaks down crying, and you're like, you feel that for him, and then he'll just jump into something like his daughter's acting up in the front row, and he's like, honey, please calm down. And then when he starts like diving into the dance number and he's crying hysterically. I remember when I lost my grandma and grandfather, and they were two of the most important people in my life, and I cared so deeply for them. With my family dynamic, I never knew my grandparents on my mother's side. I only knew my dad's parents. They cared for me so much, and I loved them, and when they passed away, which they passed away very close together, I was hysterical. It was so difficult to process it, and I remember going through a lot of those feelings that Jim's going through in that first sequence, and it just really resonated with me.
There was a moment during that scene in particular that just almost broke me a little bit, when going back to what you were saying, that he's talking about his learning disability, and there was a line that it was like gut punching, where he's like, my mom did all of these amazing things, she recorded all these things, and she would check on me how I was doing in school, and then he stops and he's like, and I messed that up as well.
He has another line a little later where he says, I didn't check up on her enough, and I didn't spend enough time with her. And like those moments of vulnerability are just so beautiful. And I truly think not enough people credit Jim Cummings, but his performance in this movie is unbelievable. And it's probably one of my favorite performances I've seen in the past 10 or 15 years. He is so incredible in this role, and he is just living and breathing the character.
When he is the character, I feel like a lot of movies will have like, they'll jump to another character, but he is the focal point of basically every scene in the movie.
Mm-hmm. And he gives it his all. That first sequence is the funeral, and then we're introduced to Jim as a cop in this small town. He is divorced from his ex-wife, who they have partial custody of their daughter, and he goes to pick up his daughter, and they go back to his house, and you can tell the relationship between him and his daughter is kind of weird. Like, it seems a little estranged. He's trying to be a good dad, but it's like almost the divorce has caused things to be even more difficult, where the mom is trying to take full custody. She's with this guy now who seems kind of seedy. You don't really get a lot of information into who he is. And then we're brought into Jim's house, where you're learning a little bit more about the relationship between him and his daughter. And what I love is that whole sequence before she gets there, where he's literally like making her a room and trying to make this place perfect. Like, he's even hanging photos on the wall that were never there before. One of the first scenes, and I'm sure Ray, that this stuck with you as much as it did with me. When he sits down at the table with his daughter and she like wants to do that high five thing or that secret handshake thing, and he's like, honey, I really can't, like I don't know what this is, like this just isn't me. And she gets so upset, and then it cuts to the next morning and she sits at the table with him and he does it with her perfectly, and he's like, go get ready for school, and the camera just slowly cuts around and he walks by and moves this chair that was sitting up against the wall where he'd drawn handprints on a piece of paper that you could tell with the bags under his eyes that he was up all night long practicing that to do that for his daughter.
Yeah, that was intense, because I feel like a lot of people don't realize, we grow up sometimes having negative feelings towards our parents. I feel like we've all grown up with some form of idea of who our parents were, but then there's this side of our parents that we don't know. And that's interesting to see, because as a parent, I relate to that, because there are some things that my kid will just not at all be having with me, and he doesn't realize like all of the heart that I'm pouring into to make him happy. But to them it's just such a small thing, but to the parent itself it's such a huge thing, because in like his case, he's a cop. He probably has a really intense schedule, and he, instead of sleeping, he chose to stay up all night to learn this thing that will probably just mean a small moment. It'll be just a small moment for his daughter, but for him it will be the world.
There's so many like brilliant nuanced moments in this film. Like one of the ones, I feel like a lot of people, even when I was in film school, a lot of people would watch this movie, and I feel like a scene that people really have an oversight for is when he goes to the mall parking lot and there's that girl, that 16-year-old girl who's in the back seat with those two guys, and he has that like conflict with them, and he's like, hey, I'm not going to leave you here, I'm going to drive you home. And she's like, no, you don't know what's going to happen if my parents see a cop pull up. And he's like, oh, I'll drive you home and drop you off down the road. And then they have that larger conversation about like being stuck in this place and in this small town, and how everything feels menial and awful, and that she doesn't want to be there for forever. It doesn't just show Jim as like a caring father. He's projecting the feelings he has about his daughter onto this young girl, and he wants to be protective and make sure that she's okay. But then you have this longer conversation about why this girl is getting involved in this. She's trapped in this place where she feels like there is no life and there is nothing for her there. And then him thinking about, is my kid gonna feel this same way being in this space? And I love that just such a simple scene like that conveys so much.
I'm having like a realization right now, but I'm going to hold that thought until we get later on into the timeline of the movie. But yeah, he's really trying to just be a good guy. That awkward scene when they're having dinner with his partner, and he's like, he's talking about the farmer's market, and he's like, will you tell me what's going on? And like, he's trying so hard to fit in. He's almost forcing himself to love his situation. Like, I need to love my town. I need to love my job. I need to love every single thing about my life here for my daughter. Just thought that was really interesting, because he has that conversation where he's like, will you tell me what's going on around town so I can be more involved?
Also, his partner is one of my favorite characters in the movie. It's almost like his partner's life with his partner's wife and his kids is like the ideal scenario of what Jim wants for his life. So the whole movie, you're getting that like projected of like, he goes to see his partner and he sees the relationship. His partner's wife and him have a really great relationship, and they're clearly close with their kids. And it's almost like that is what Jim wants with his life, and that inclusion of that character is that. And I love that moment at the dinner table. Then you cut into a more serious scene where they do that bust at the restaurant where the person had pulled the knife. That's more just like showing the extreme nature of the job and what those people have to go through on a day-to-day.
I thought it was really interesting during the day show that those scenes almost back to back, but there's a moment at the dinner table where he is trying to tell the kids about this like heroic thing their dad did, and he hasn't told them. And it makes me wonder if he hasn't said anything, because him as a parent, he's like, I don't want to worry and bring these hardships that I deal with on the job home. So it's like his kids are not aware that his dad has done all these things. Meanwhile, Jim is just spilling the beans on everything they've done together, because in Jim's eyes, he is a hero and he should be celebrated for it. But the way I interpret it is maybe his partner is like, I don't want my family to know this, because I don't want them to be scared for what I'm doing every day.
It leads us into the real crux of the film, which is that his wife tries to take sole custody over their child, which is really interesting because it doesn't seem like it's really her decision. It's the guy that she's dating. The crazy part is what really hits hard for me, and it kind of breaks me apart a lot when I watch the movie, is I don't have a relationship with my dad anymore. And my dad is really not a very good person, and he's done a lot of very terrible things in his life. My parents, when they first started to split up, there was a lot going on between them, and a lot was said back and forth, and there was a lot of manipulation on my siblings, who also went through a lot. Each parent was trying to get you to feel a specific way about the other one because they were trying to push you off on one another. But what really moves me, and it's hard for me to watch even, is Jim goes to court to fight for the one thing in his life that he loves more than anything in the world, and he can't even talk bad about his wife. And he says, I don't have anything negative to say about the way that my wife raises my daughter. And like, to me, that shows Jim's character in every way that you need to know. Is like, this man is such a good father that even though, as we learn later in the film, that there are things going on in her life and in the mom's life that aren't good and that could negatively impact her, he's not willing to trash talk his wife.
Well, and then we'll get a little bit more into that, but that you see a lot more of that on the ramping up on the final moments of the movie, and we'll get to that. But yeah, it's interesting to see that because on the surface, Jim is kind of an unstable guy, but he has a heart of gold. He is really just wanting the best. And in fact, I thought it was interesting where the lawyer is like, you don't want to go for full custody? And he's like, no, I believe she needs both of us.
He can't even talk bad about her. I mean, it's, and that heart of gold thing you say is like, you can tell the financial impact that keeping his mother's dance studio is having on his life. And he loves his mom so much he won't give it up. And that, I think that adds even more. And then obviously that situation changes as we get later into the movie, but like the fact that he's not willing to compromise these things because he wants to like keep his mom's legacy alive, and he wants to be a good son, and he wants to be a good dad.
And I think that plays into him not wanting to trash talk his ex-wife, because he's just trying to maintain a good balance on everything. But sometimes trying to maintain a good balance of everything is what's making your life so unbalanced. Between the dance studio, the custody battle, the death of his mom, and he's trying to juggle everything perfectly, but everything keeps stumbling at the same time.
And being the good guy ends up fucking him over. I mean, he loses custody of his daughter, and it's awful. And it's probably one of the most heartbreaking scenes in a film I've watched, where he makes one comment towards the judge, and the judge looks at him and says, is that a threat? And he like backtracks. And that moment of vulnerability, and Ray, I don't know if it shook you up as much as it did me, where he looks at him in the face and says, please, I don't want to lose my daughter. It like shook me up almost more than anything else in the film, because he comes in his police uniform and he's trying to present himself, and he does a really great job at the way that he presents himself, and it's just that one slip up. And it's like you said, the man has so much going on at one time in his life that one slip up, as minuscule as it seems, can affect the entire course of his life.
So for me, I think the scene was right before the line before that one. The one that got me is when he was like, I'm just scared that I'm going to lose my daughter because I said a stupid thing to a judge.
Yeah.
That line is so impactful to me because we all have felt that way. We all have said the thing that we don't necessarily mean or don't necessarily feel, but we are so desperate that we are just grasp at straws. And unfortunately, we do live in a unforgiving society where, you know, a lot of people say that you are judged by your merits, but in reality, we do live in a cruel world where we can do everything right, but if we do one thing wrong, they crucify us for it. And I feel like that was conveyed so well in that scene when he's talking to the judge.
And then, yeah, and so he does lose custody of his daughter, and that's when the film kind of spirals. Barricades himself in his house. He's drunk all the time. He starts like neglecting work, and then he has this literal freak out outside of the police station where he gets into a fight with his partner because his partner accidentally let the video of him, and we can say that it was his partner, but we don't really know. But the video of him at the funeral leaks, and that's what ends up causing him to lose custody of his daughter. Is they see this video of him doing this dance and they think that he's unstable, and he starts yelling at his partner about that, oh, you didn't delete it off the cloud, you didn't do this, and they start fighting, and he actually like pulls his gun out. It's like a really tense moment, and the chief of police is like, drop your gun, and he like strips his clothes off completely, and he breaks down crying, and it is just such like a vulnerable and beautiful moment of the bottom. This is it. I've lost my job, I've lost my friend, and I've lost my family. And I wanted to say this earlier, but I feel like Ray and I are talking about this movie, and it's very dramatic, but I don't think Ray or I, either one, wants to pull away from the fact that this is a really funny movie.
Yeah, it's hilarious.
There's like a moment, it's not in the same scene, but when he knocks his partner over, but later on when he's talking to his partner again, he's like, I'm sorry I committed a hate crime against you. There's so many comedic moments amidst all the serious drama, but that scene outside the police station, it's tough to watch.
That scene in particular, it is really hard to watch, especially because we've all felt that. I've been having some stress from my job, as I'm sure we all do. I'm not special for it. We all have stresses from our jobs, but that moment where he was like, I'm out there, and he's talking about all the things that he's done, and he doesn't mention it, but you can see he has scars on his body. Like he's probably has been harmed or shot or stabbed in the job, and he's saying all these things that he's done for the force. You realize that at the end of the day, a job is a job, and you are expendable, and it's almost like he's not allowed to have a weak moment, because that moment of weakness will cost him everything. But they make mention that he's a decorated officer. You see the scars on his body, maybe he's been hurt or something like that. And he has this moment of where his mom died, he's losing custody of his daughter, he's having all these issues, and that moment of vulnerability and weakness will cost him everything.
And that leads Ray and I into a scene we actually talked about off the podcast beforehand that I think hit us both really hard, which is where he goes to visit his sister. And he realizes that he hasn't seen her for a long time, and he's talking about her kids and everything, and she starts pouring on all of the stuff that's going on in her life while still being concerned with Jim. And what's really great and what shows Jim's character is how much he cares for his sister, and how he's kind of willing to drop all the shit that he's got going on to take care of his sister and to love his sister.
The part that hit me the hardest, because one of the things that his sister kind of vents about is the relationship he had with his mom versus the relationship she had with her mom. He is there and he's talking, and he showed up unannounced, and at one point she kind of starts venting about everything going on in her life at the time, and he just kind of smiles, and it's not like a mean-spirited smile. It's a very sweet and honest smile, and looks at her like, I caught you at a bad time. Even though his life has fallen apart, it doesn't become the centerpiece. He's like, oh. And like, if you compare what's happening in her life versus what's happening in his, it's obvious that he's having a way tougher time, but he still just kind of nods his head like, it's okay. We don't need to worry about me. I'll be okay.
And the fact that everything is going bad, and he asks her for that cup of coffee, and he goes outside the house and he dumps the coffee and puts money in it and sets it on her porch because he's so worried about his sister. And then you can talk about it, Ray, because I know you said it hit you just as hard as it did me.
So right after he puts the cup of coffee down, he goes down the stairs of the front porch, and in the bushes there's a duffel bag that you see early on before he leaves, that he has packed clothes in there. And he grabs the duffel bag, puts it over his shoulder, and leaves, almost alluding like he was expecting, like he was hoping he could stay with them. And that scene just broke me, because I know I have, and I'm sure you have too, Nate. We've all been in a situation where we are hoping somebody will be there for us, and we are desperately hoping for someone to hear us out and help us out. And I think I've said this before to people. I was like, I just wish I was the vulnerable one for once. I just wish I was the one being taken care of for once, instead of taking care of everybody else. So I feel like he was going in hoping, can I just be weak for a moment and asks for help, but instead he worries about his sister and just grabs his bag and leaves. And that moment of selflessness where everything in his life has fallen apart and he was just hoping for someone to throw him a bone, and he still chooses to just forget about himself and help out others, was just, it was admirable, but it was also heartbreaking at the same time.
And I feel like that just leads to the fact that this movie is just such an emotional roller coaster, because right after that happens, he goes to visit his mom's grave. And he has this moment where he starts really vulnerably talking to his mom. And Ray, you talked about this off the podcast with me, when he stops and he goes, "Mom, this is so stupid." Like he's saying, talking to this grave, his mom can't really hear him, but he just wants that person in his life that he loves so much to listen and to provide him some kind of relief. Part of that scene that breaks me is he says, "Please help my sister." And he drops everything about himself to say, "Mom, if you could do anything, help my sister." He's so selfless that he just wants her to have a better life, and he forgets everything about himself at that moment.
Especially where he's like, "You don't have to worry about me anymore." He's just so ready to help out. He just wants to help everybody. And the funny thing about these scenes, we talk about them like they're these really heartbreaking moments, which they are, but there's comedy being thrown in left and right. Like, I actually laughed out loud when he was like, "Hey, Mom, this is stupid."
Yeah. And I think that's, it's crazy because we talked early on in the podcast today about giving these small filmmakers a chance. This is an Academy Award winning performance, in my opinion.
100%.
I think the fact that this movie was overlooked and that Jim didn't get an Academy Award nomination, this is honestly, in all the years of watching film, it's one of the most brilliant performances I've ever seen. The comedy doesn't feel ham-fisted, it just feels real. It feels like a person who, this is their personality, this is the way that they normally are, and the comedy is to try to escape the reality, and it's balanced brilliantly.
I feel like that's a normal thing too for people. I think a lot of people expect these very like over the top drama or a very, I don't know, irreverent thing, but I think most people walk a fine line between the both, where I can crack a joke while I'm crying, like I've been known that I'm having a mental breakdown and I'm still cracking jokes. Or I could be in the happiest place in my life and I'll still say something really sad. Just to give you an example, yesterday at work, I went up to someone and I was like, "Hey, you look like you're really happy today." And my coworker looks at me, he's like, "Well, you can keep it." I was like, "You want me to keep your happiness? That's super emo." And like, maybe she was having a hard time and I just kind of made light of it, but that's also who I am. I crack jokes to escape from the awfulness that this world can be sometimes, especially given things happening recently. Sometimes you just need to release a little bit of humor to just get you through the day.
Exactly. And that brings Ray and I into the next scene, which is the first moment of brevity that Jim gets in the whole film, which is when his partner comes to visit him at his house. And he's completely like, he's like almost irreconcilable in his bed, and he's in his daughter's room, like on her bed, and everything's been stripped away, and it's like the room is just barren. And he goes, "Come on, let's go outside and smoke some cigars and have a couple drinks." And the partner, and this scene broke me too, Ray, and I know I keep saying that, but there's so many scenes in this movie that break me. When his partner goes downstairs and calls his wife and says, I love you so much. And just like that moment of like him realizing the things in his life that are important, and Jim finally gets dressed and comes downstairs, and he's really coming to save his partner's life. He wants to make sure he's okay.
And that's such an impactful scene because given the fact that he literally slapped him and pulled a gun on him, most people would be like, "No, screw that guy." But his partner is still there, which I think goes to show the level of loyalty. I have a family member that's a police officer, but I don't know enough about his job to know what he does on an everyday basis. But I imagine when you're putting your life in the line with somebody else, there has to be a bond that forms over that. and being able to let go of like, this guy's having a tough time and I just want to make sure he's okay, even though, maybe according to the movie timeline, a day ago he was, quote unquote, committing a hate crime against him.
And then that scene leads you into, he ends up having to sell his mom's dance studio because he's losing his job at the police force. He doesn't have enough money to pay for his house. And that's when it leads us into, he's driving in his truck and a cop pulls him over. And the cop looks at him and says, "Hey, they're trying to get a hold of you." And he says, "What?" And he tries to get back into his car, and his car door is locked and he can't get in. And he finally just takes the cop's baton off of him and breaks his window to get his phone.
Which, by the way, that scene messed me up a little bit because I was like, what now? What now? Like, what else can they do to this poor guy?
And so he finally gets it, and he gets the call that there's something going on at his ex-wife's house. And he drives there, and what you find out is that she OD'd on heroin and that his daughter is the one who called it in. And I remember the first time I watched this movie, when he walked in and he saw his wife there OD'd on heroin, I had to pause the movie because I couldn't even console myself with everything that he'd been through already. And it was just like, not to mention the fact that he went to bat for her at the court, and seeing like he's just so broken. And obviously, I don't want this to detract from the fact to say drug addiction is not a joke, and drug addiction is something that so many people go through, and it's a mental health issue. It's really hard to judge a person for having that happen and to use drugs to overcome issues in their lives. And seeing Jim break down at that, and the speech that he has where he looks at his wife's corpse and he says, he's like, "I loved you so much, but I hate you so much in this moment right now." And he like grabs her hand and he kisses her hand and he says, "This is for me and our daughter." And then he says, "And this is for our daughter in the future and her future husband." And he smacks her in the face.
I won't get too much into details, but a friend of mine had a similar tragedy happened to him, and I remember him looking at me and he's like, "Ray, I have never loved and hated someone as much as I do right now."
I've read some Letterboxd reviews of some people that are really mean towards Jim about that scene because they talk about drug addiction and how hard it is on mental health, and I understand that, but you have to think, if you put yourself into Jim's scenario in that moment, you have literally lost custody of your child, but you went to bat for your partner. And also, despite the drug addiction and the mental health issues there, you just let your daughter not only find you that way, but she had to be the one to call the police. And you would, regardless of you processing that situation and saying, okay, this is obviously a mental health issue, drug addiction is severe, you would be enraged at that moment. And so I understand every feeling that he is going through in that second.
I feel like a lot of people sometimes forget, and I know I am, I'll include myself in that same boat. We all forget that there's another side to every story. And I remember a couple of years ago, we had a tragedy that happened in our family. And I remember everyone kind of taking sides on this tragedy. But what people don't realize when things like this happen is there is the person struggling, and then there's the people that are left to grieve that struggle. So I feel like, yes, drug addiction is no joke, and any form of addiction is no joke, and we should do something to help those people out. But at the same time, the people that are suffering because of somebody else's addiction, they also are suffering. So like, I feel like we sometimes forget that there's two sides to the victim. They're both victims at the end, because if you think about it, in this case of this movie, something that he's probably going to have to deal with the financial downfall of that death. He's probably going to have to deal with a lot of, I guess we can move forward to this scene where he's talking to his daughter. He's like, just because they died doesn't mean they didn't want to be with you. And he's going to have to deal with the ramifications of the trauma that has been created for this little 9-year-old girl.
It's difficult, and it's really a hard scene to watch, but there's also that comedic brevity introduced where he's like talking about it and he looks at her and he says, "Do you want to run away together?" And he starts crying and says, "Oh my God, it's the song."
Yes, and I
Yeah.
was talking about earlier. The song where he was like, "Do you want to run away together?" But then there's making a callback to that girl, that teenage girl that wants to leave this town, and I feel like there's this motif throughout the movie of we just want to leave this place.
And also, Ray, I have to ask the last scene where he takes his daughter to the ballet, which obviously was important to his mom, and she's like kind of off put by it. The daughter is at first when they go, and then watching her be so enamored with it and just hooked on watching it, and Jim looking over at her and just breaking down crying, and also like the most beautiful orchestral version of Bon Iver's Skinny Love playing in the background that just is like, to me, a perfect closer to the film.
Yes, and I love the motif needing to leave. So that's kind of, so just a little background. I moved to Utah when I was 24 after I had been really just struggling with some like depression and I just needed to leave. And me leaving didn't mean I didn't want to be with my family and friends anymore. It just mean I personally needed to leave and get a fresh start elsewhere. And I feel like that's such a motif going on in this movie. Sometimes you just gotta leave. I think it's perfect for the theme of Thunder Road, that sometimes you just need to skip town and leave. And in this case, he was able to do that with his daughter. And, you know, there's this illusion that they are doing better as far as their relationship goes. I'm sure they're still dealing with trauma and the downfall of all of that. But at the end of the day, the guy finally catches a break.
And I don't know if you guys can tell, but Ray and I really like this movie. I'm so glad you liked it this much, Ray, because it's one of those movies that I saw and I tell everyone to watch it, and so far everyone I've recommended it to has loved it.
It is great. And honestly, I know we pretty much just set the entire plot of the movie, like beat by beat. But honestly, even if you watched it and you're like, well, I got it all spoiled, just go watch it.
Because we can't even do it its due diligence. Even if you know everything that's going to happen, the way that the information is presented and the performances in the film, like, it will still shake you. You will still feel something. So Ray, I'm so glad we got to talk about Turbo Kid and Thunder Road, because obviously, as our audience is going to know, they're two drastically different movies, but they're also both incredibly enjoyable for very different reasons.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I feel like at the end of the day, that's kind of the beauty of film, is that if it brings you joy and if it makes you happy, and obviously if it's not harming or being, you know, disrespectful to others, you do it, because that's the beauty about film. If you connect with it, whether it's a dystopian gore bloodbath or a heartfelt story about a dad trying to just desperately get a break in life, if you connect with it and if it makes you feel something, then that movie has succeeded. I heard this from a movie critic. I forget who it was. He says he prefers hating a movie than being lukewarm on the movie. Because he's like, if I hated a movie, if I was so reviled and off put by a movie, then that means the movie made me feel something. But if I'm just like lukewarm on the movie, I was like, oh, it's okay, then the movie kind of failed at making me feel something.
Exactly. The best movies are the movies that challenge you. And I love films that do that. Like, the movie I always think about, because I love seeing people's reactions, is Lars von Trier's Antichrist. Because that is a movie that conveys really heavy subject matter, but also the brutality and the violence in it are so over the top. And even people that say they hate the movie, I'm like, it did its job. It made you uncomfortable. It made you feel something, and it made you hurt for the characters, and that's what its goal was.
Yeah, that movie, I haven't seen it, but I do know of the reputation Lars von Trier has with his filmmaking style. It's subversive and it makes you feel things. And I think it was actually a review of The House That Jack Built where this reviewer said that. It's like, I'd rather be moved, even if I hate it, even if the emotions are negative and I am just absolutely disgusted by it, The film succeeded at making me feel something.
Those are the type of movies that Ray and I are going to want to talk about on the podcast, like what we talked about earlier, Grown Ups too. It will make you feel something.
It will, whether that's a good thing or bad, that's entirely up to you.
This is a part of the podcast that I think you've grown to love. I know I've grown to love it, and that's answering some questions.
Even though some of these questions really get me thinking, and sometimes I don't want to give the answer. But yes, it is. At least it's really fun to get my gears going and really thinking about some of these things. One of the questions in particular, I was very excited because in my brain, I just made like a list of like 4 different categories, and we'll get into the question here in a second.
One of the things I want to plug before we do that is, and I'll say this right now, don't be afraid to ask us questions. And Ray said this in an earlier episode. There is no such thing as a stupid question. So if you head over to the Real Monsters podcast on Instagram, or if you hit up Ray's page at Analog C or me at My Exit Unfair, you can comment on our posts about the podcast. You can DM us directly. Ask us questions because we want to answer the questions that you have.
Absolutely. Please do. Even if it's just in casual conversation. Man, if you want us to watch Grown Ups 2, sure, do it. Ask us, and
we'll do it.
Worst case scenario is we won't watch it.
I'm hoping, Ray, that we can do an episode where we watch some like intentionally bad movies, because I think we would have a blast going all the way through and watching those. First question today is, what is your favorite film trilogy?
So I'll start off because this is the one where I started going through like 1,000 different trilogies in my brain. And I think I've narrowed it down to 3.
Oh, down to 3. And I'm ready.
It's 3 trilogies. The first one, and this one, it's more of like a trilogy that has helped me connect with other people. My older brother, the guy that designed our logo, he is a huge Lord of the Rings fan. He loves the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And when I moved to the United States, I didn't know the language, and I was really kind of nervous by everything and scared of being in a new country. And my brother and I kind of became each other's best friends because we didn't know anybody. And the way we connected was through the Lord of the Rings movie. We would watch those movies, and he's obsessed with them. He likes them far more than I ever will. Lord of the Rings trilogy, I know that's kind of a safe choice for a lot of people, but the fact that in a time where I was scared and worried about being in a new country, being able to watch these movies, disconnect from the world for just a split second and enjoy this film with my brother, it's become a staple of our family now to watch these Lord of the Rings movies. They just bring joy and comfort to me. So Lord of the Rings would be one of the first picks I would do.
That's a really great pick. The Lord of the Rings trilogy is one that's really important to me, and I love that franchise quite a bit. So I would say that is a very good choice.
The other pick, and I'll make these next 2 quick ones because just for time constraint. The other one is an abstract pick because this is not a continuous trilogy. It's more of like a spiritual trilogy. And this one is just one of my favorite trilogies because I just love them and I think they're important to film history. And that is the George Romero's of the Dead trilogy. Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead.
We're just going to erase the Land of the Dead and all the ones after that are not as good as those 3. But yes, I love those 3 movies as well.
And they're not trilogies in the sense that it's a continuous story, but they take place in the same universe. They have similar subject matters, and they're all using, and I think we were talking about this earlier, they were all using a social commentary through a zombie story. And I just think those movies changed the game for, not just for horror, but just for filmmaking in general. And
I don't think anyone gives enough credit to Day of the Dead for how fucking good that movie is. I like Day of the Dead more than Dawn of the Dead.
And for those who haven't seen Day of the Dead, the Gorillaz have used reference to Day of the Dead and Dawn of the Dead in their music. So if you're a fan of the Gorillaz, odds are you've been exposed to some of those. The third pick, and this one is just, it's a nostalgia pick. I grew up watching these movies. I love these movies. I can watch these movies over and over and over again and never get tired. Yes, I am aware that they have been picked apart and they have been shown some of the plot holes in them, but I will never get tired of the Back to the Future trilogy.
Oh, hell yeah. That's a great choice. The Back to the Future movies are wonderful. I love them. I have such a nostalgic place in my heart for those movies.
Me too. And I remember this is kind of fun because I don't think a lot of people sometimes realize this. So as I mentioned over and over, I was born in El Salvador and I grew up watching a lot of movies that were subtitled, but we actually had copies of Back to the Future in Spanish. They were dubbed in Spanish. And when I moved to the United States, obviously I started watching them in English. But then when they reissued, they did that 4K 35 anniversary remaster that they did a couple years ago. It had the dub track of the same track that they used for the movie when I grew up. So it was the exact same version of when I was a little kid, the same dub translation from when I was a little kid. And
wow.
That just like has made rewatching those movies such an experience all over again.
That is so awesome. That's 3 really great answers.
What about you? If I didn't steal some already.
I originally had only picked 1, but I'm going to say 2 now just because I feel like I can. So I have my all-time favorite, but first I'm going to say my sentimental favorite, which my sentimental favorite trilogy is the Indiana Jones trilogy. And no, I'm not going to add Kingdom of the Crystal Skull in there, even though I don't think it's a terrible movie, but I don't consider it
it was a perfect trilogy. If the first 3 were A+, that one went down to like a B-.
My wife had never seen the Indiana Jones franchise until last year for the first time, where we watched them all together. And so I rewatched Kingdom of the Crystal Skull with her for the first time since probably the theater, and I didn't dislike it as much this time as I did when I watched it. I think it's because I had really high expectations, but the original trilogy, the reason why it means so much to me is my brother Luke and I were like a year apart, and we shared a bedroom with each other till I was like 21 years old, and we really bonded heavily over movies our whole lives. And the Indiana Jones franchise, like, we would watch it over and over again, specifically Temple of Doom, which I will fight to the death that I think Temple of Doom is the best Indiana Jones film.
You don't have
care.
to. That is the best one.
Temple of Doom is like the most fun. And did you know, because I didn't know this till I was in my 30s, did you know Temple of Doom is a prequel to Raiders of the Lost Ark?
And now I know that in my 30s.
I had no idea. Like, I finally got that information, and I'm like, oh, it leads up to it, which I thought was really awesome. But that movie's super campy and fun, and obviously the best technically made one is Last Crusade. But I love all 3 of those movies, and they hold a lot of sentimental value to me. And now to translate into my favorite trilogy of all time, my favorite trilogy of films, I actually just did a review for them on YouTube, so I won't talk too heavily into it, but it's the Before trilogy from Richard Linklater. I love these movies with all my heart. I think it's the most vulnerable and beautiful story about romance ever created. It's about blossoming young love turning into establishing love with a person, to then the trials and tribulations that come to what even the best and strongest couples have to deal with. And it is just such a vulnerable and amazing dialogue. Some of my favorite cinematography in any films imaginable. The Criterion restoration of those films is beautiful, and I cannot recommend those movies enough. Have you seen them, Ray?
I don't think I have. No, I think, are the Before trilogies the one that like each, oh no, that's a different one. Never mind. I'm thinking of a color one, the one that has the color.
The Three Colors trilogy from Kieslowski. That's another incredible trilogy.
That's the one I was thinking of.
Yeah, the Before trilogy. So it's really cool. It's Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy, and Richard Linklater actually shot each movie like 10 years apart.
Oh, really?
So it's like the first film is called Before Sunrise, and Ethan Hawke's character goes on vacation to Europe, and he runs into Julie Delpy's character on a train, and they start talking to each other, and almost all the dialogue sequences are one take, and they're so impressive. And so they start flirting with each other, and they really bond over this train ride, and Ethan Hawke looks at her and says, hey, let's go through town together, and let's run through the city together. You have nothing to lose, you don't have anywhere to go. And so it's all about this one night together in Vienna that they spend together. And at the end of the movie, Ethan Hawke has to go back to America, and they say, hey, in 5 years, let's meet each other in this exact spot. Well, the second movie, 10 years has gone by, and neither one of them was able to make it, but Ethan Hawke has written a book, and he's on a book tour in Europe, and she comes into the bookshop that he's doing a signing at.
He was able to get the same actors to come back every 10 years to film them?
Yep.
Wow.
It's absolutely unbelievable. The performances are just some of the best I've ever seen. And I watched it recently, and it's one of those I could just watch them over and over and over again and never get tired of them.
Well, now I know what I'm picking up for the Criterion sale coming up.
I will tell you, I actually got it on the Criterion sale last time. I think I paid like $35 for it. Best $35 I've ever spent.
I'm excited. I'm gonna add that one to the list to pick up for the next sale.
My next Criterion sale pickup is going to be Pink Flamingos. Which I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, but it is a treat.
No, look, you're just adding stuff to my list, man.
Oh, it's so many good movies. So this leads to our last question of the episode, which we kind of hinted at a little bit earlier, Ray. And this is less of like a specific question, but more just our opinions. And this question asks, what are our opinions on streaming versus seeing films in a theater?
I have talked to people about this multiple times. One of the things I hated most about COVID was movie theaters not open. I made the joke one time that when movie theaters are opening, I made a post on Instagram where I was like, I'm so excited to go back to church. And I posted a picture of like the hallway at my local movie theater. Because I am 110% a movie theater guy. I adore the movies. There's this great... Have you ever seen the movie The Producers?
Yes.
But the one with Matthew Broderick.
Yes, I love that movie.
Oh, wait. No, not The Producers. Sorry. It was the one where he's... Or maybe it is. It's the one where he's filming a movie, but it's just a cover-up for the FBI.
I can't remember which one that is. You said it's Matthew Broderick?
So... It is Matthew Broderick. So anyways, point being is I forget the name of the movie, but basically the premise of the movie, he's filming and he's supposedly filming a movie, but it's actually a cover for the FBI to do a drug bust. But he's been given an actual budget to hire actual actors and to do sets and everything. And Matthew Broderick is this like up and coming filmmaker, and he's just so excited that somebody quote unquote took interest. There's a scene where he is talking to Joan Cusack, is the person playing this role, and she's talking about how like she had this traumatic experience where she became this like agoraphobic who would never leave the house. And she's like, and I talked to my therapist and he finally gave me the courage to go out. And the first thing I did when I went out was to go to the movies. And she just describes this movie, going to the theaters, as this like almost spiritual experience. I'm watching a movie here and I am texting you. It's like, oh man, hey, Thunder Road, this scene is great. But I wish I could have seen that movie with the lights dimmed, no cell phone, no, kid crying on the background, or no, people texting me. It's you and this experience. And for, 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever it may be, the world doesn't matter. It's just you and the movie. And I've always just been a big fan of going to the movies. And I always tell people, please watch whatever you're into. It doesn't matter what it is. Watch it in the big screen. Maybe it's not a movie that's like a spectacle, but being able to watch something without the distractions, it's so much more impactful to me than anything else. Sure, streaming is fun, and I enjoy putting on a movie and just making me a pizza or something. I love that. I do that all the time, but I will take the movie going experience any day of the week.
Also, Ray, just so you know, that movie is called The Last Shot from 2004.
Thank you.
If you want my opinion on that, I am also like you, Ray. I love going to the theater, and I think there is no experience like seeing a film in the theater for the first time, because there is that pressure now in a society that we're filled with technology and constant distraction, that there is that ability for you to just like pull up your phone or like do something where when you're in a theater you're completely committed. But also at the same time, I'm not like a movie theater elitist. I think there is a time and a place for streaming. And I think, thank God for streaming services, that they have given the ability to a lot of filmmakers that weren't able to get their material seen the platform that they can. Like, I know you're a fan of it, and so am I, but Shudder is a perfect example of that. Shudder has given so many filmmakers the ability for their films to be seen. I think of a filmmaker who we both love a lot, Panos Cosmatos, where his film Mandy didn't do so hot in the box office, but Shudder has kind of given a new life to that film and created a cult following for Panos Cosmatos. So I'm grateful that streaming exists and that there is a platform for those filmmakers to put out their content. But if I personally had a choice, I would like to see things on a big screen for the first time I see them, because you're seeing it with the sound design the way it's intended, correct aspect ratio, all that little detail. But I do think there's a time and a place for both.
Yeah, and I agree. And yeah, just to clarify, I'm not a movie theater elitist. I just, if the possibility is there, I will pick the theater before streaming. But yeah, sometimes, especially with the times that we live in, you can't go watch every movie. That's just really expensive. So I get that. But just on a side note, real quick, Mandy in theaters is one of the best movie theater experiences I've had.
I can only imagine. I love that movie a lot, and I will credit a friend of you and I both, Mr. Nate Beasley, who I have never met a person more obsessed with a movie than Nate is with Mandy. And if we ever do a Mandy episode on here, which we did do an Instagram talk, we would have to invite Nate on, because that man loves him some Panos Cosmatos.
Yeah, and that's saying a lot considering we really love him, but I feel like he puts both of us to shame when it comes to Pano.
Oh my God. When I went and visited him and we hung out, the man has such a knowledge of that film. It's just absolutely unbelievable. That's our questions for the week. And Ray, I think this was another really great episode. I had a lot of fun. This whole platform of like dissecting these films and kind of picking them apart, I really like that vibe, and I like the opinions that we both give towards the films.
And I know that there's like so many films out there, and I'm excited that we get to talk about some of these smaller films. Hopefully more people get exposed to, but much like a lot of people that haven't seen Thunder Road or Turbo Kid, there's a lot of movies we haven't seen. So maybe you don't have a question, but you have a movie recommendation, also hit us up on our socials. We want to know.
Absolutely. And if you want to hit us up on our socials, I know I said them earlier, but just to reiterate, we have the Real Monsters podcast on Instagram, where you can hit Ray and I both up, or you can hit Ray up on his personal Instagram at AnalogC, or my personal Instagram at MyExitUnfair. We are very responsive. We will talk to you guys. We will answer any questions that you have. And even if you have recommendations of episodes you'd like us to make, Ray and I are very open to the possibility of kind of doing whatever, because we're just having fun as we go about this.
Also, if you're interested in joining the conversation, also hit us up and maybe we can work something out.
Yes, absolutely. We're always willing to include people, to have people in our conversation, and we're looking forward to the future, which, speaking of the future, Ray and I had so much fun doing this today that we discussed earlier. We would like a reason to discuss the other two filmmakers that Ray and I recommended in the second episode in our next episode. So we're both going to pick films. I'm going to pick a film from Patrick Bryce, and Ray is going to pick a film from Benson and Moorhead, and we're going to discuss that. And we're actually going to discuss two films from each of those filmmakers. So the pick I choose for Patrick Bryce is we are going to watch Creep 1 and Creep 2. And for you, Ray?
Well, in the spirit of doing two-part movies for Benson and Moorhead, I'm going to pick Resolution and The Endless, that are basically spiritual sequels,
which I just watched, and I cannot wait to talk about those movies.
So please also go watch them. I know the Creep movies, because I already added them to my queue to watch, are on Netflix, both 1 and 2.
Yes.
And I believe The Endless and Resolution are they both in Shudder, or just The Endless?
So they are both on Shudder. You can actually find the entire Benson and Moorhead catalog on Shudder right now, except for Synchronic, which is on Netflix. Or if you don't have a Shudder subscription, you can find Resolution, Spring, and The Endless on Tubi right now.
There you go. So go watch them so you can join us in the conversation too, via comments, messages. And if you watch them early enough, maybe you can hit us up and tell us about something that you want us to address about it, if you make the time to watch them.
That is perfect. Well, once again, everyone, thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next time.
All right, take care, everybody.